evening and a very warm welcome to the conference Exploring Intersectionality, Building Solidarity Across EU-Turkey Borders, Inclusive Education in Times of Forced Migration and COVID-19. We are Joanna Szyminska and Ellen Collender. We are both Mercator IPC Fellows at the Istanbul Policy Center of Sabancı University and the organizers of this conference, which is supported by the IPC Sabancı University Stiftung Mercator Initiative in collaboration with the Migration Research Center at Koç University in Istanbul and the Feminist Autonomous Center for Research in Athens. Yeah, this conference was motivated by several developments that currently take place in Turkey and the European Union. One of these events is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which, and we've heard this quite often in the last couple of months, affected us all, but not all of us equally. So the effects of the pandemic have deepened several social inequalities that are structured mainly along the lines of class, race, gender, age, and disability. And it has also been shown that these inequalities are reproduced and exacerbated by the international border regime, which becomes particularly evident with regard to the current situation of children in refugee camps at the borders of Turkey and the European Union.
The consequences of COVID-19 for migration, forced migrants, and migration societies are currently the subject of several discussions. In this conference, we would like to focus this discussion on a particular social field, namely education, a field where social inclusion and exclusion are permanently negotiated and decided on. In this conference, we will ask, how do the developments of the pandemic exacerbate educational injustices against the backdrop of anti-immigrant discourses and neoliberal transformations in Turkey and the EU? How does the current re-emergence of symbolic and material borders affect the right to education and non-discrimination, especially of children seeking protection in Turkey and the EU? And how do different categories of marginalization and layers of oppression intersect when it comes to the situation of so-called refugee children within different education systems and settings? But in this conference, we will not only focus on forms of intersectional discrimination and belonging of children in times of forced migration and COVID-19. This conference will also deal with approaches and strategies that tackle current exclusionary dynamics in education, as they have been developed in recent years by various civil society initiatives, of which some are represented at this conference today and tomorrow also. Together with them and you, the audience, we would like to discuss how notions of solidarity can go beyond nation-state solutions and be fostered when addressing global educational injustices.
Yeah, and we are delighted that so many important voices and perspectives from the research, the education, and the civil society sector, mainly from Turkey, Greece, and Germany, are coming together today and tomorrow to exchange their knowledge, their experiences, and their perspectives on these very important topics and questions. And we hope that this event will provide an opportunity to explore the extent to which we can learn from each other and to build solidarity networks beyond the national context, while being, of course, aware that the scope for exchange and networking within the setting of such a digital conference is a little bit limited, but we hope that this conference can stimulate further discussion, collaboration, and exchange. And to stay informed about any potential future events, we already would like to invite you to subscribe to our newsletter at our website, which is inclusiveeducationacrossborders.com, and there is a minus between each word. Yeah, we would like to give the floor now to the moderator of this first panel, Deniz Yükseker, and we wish you all an interesting and fruitful discussion. And yeah, thank you all very much for participating in this conference. Deniz, the floor is yours.
Good evening, all. I'm Deniz Yükseker. I'm in the Political Science and International Relations Department of Istanbul Aydın University. And first of all, I would like to thank Ellen and Joanna for their introductions and for actually doing the work of organizing this really important conference. And I would also like to thank Sabancı University's IPC Stiftung Mercator initiative for organizing or hosting this conference. Okay, without further delay, let me tell you about what we're going to do in this panel. The title of our panel is Reinforcing Borders and Images of the Other in Light of COVID-19, New Gateways for Discrimination Against Refugee Children in Education. As Joanna and Ellen mentioned, of course, COVID-19 pandemic has actually created conditions in which discriminative and prejudicial discourses have been on the rise towards refugees and migrants. And in this panel, we're going to discuss how these dynamics, negative dynamics, actually result in or reinforce educational inequalities. And we have 4 speakers. Professor Ayhan Kaya from Istanbul Bilgi University's Department of International Relations. Then Liz Fekete from the Institute of Race Relations in London. Then Zachariah Farzad, the third speaker will be Zachariah Farzad from Wave of Hope for the Future Refugee Schools in Rome. And finally, Mohamed Jouni from the BBC Center for Young Refugees in Berlin. And finally, we will also have a discussant, Professor Maria do Mar Castro Varela, from the Alice Solomon University in Berlin, who will actually speak to all 4 of the presentations. And of course, we also hope to have time for a moderated discussion after the 4 presentations end, but before the discussants' comments. So, okay, without further delay, I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ayhan Kaya. As I said, he is a professor of political science and the Jean Monnet Chair of European Politics of Interculturalism at Istanbul Bilgi University. And today, the title of his presentation is Right-Wing Populism and Its Effects on Refugees and Their Children. The floor is yours, Ayhan. Thank you.
Deniz Hocam, thank you very much. I also would like to start expressing my gratitude to Joanna and Ellen for organizing, for initiating such an important debate, which is concentrating on education of refugee children and youngsters. And also, I would like to thank all the contributing institutions for making this event possible. So I've got a few slides to share with you. This is, let me, it was here, just a second. This is about borders and refugees, but I will talk about some other borders, actually. I will talk about some mental borders, some civilizational borders, some cultural borders, and some religious borders, which we encounter lately in the European Union countries. And I will do that based on my own research over the last 3 years from different Horizon 2020 projects, critical heritages, which was recently completed, and an ongoing research project called Respond, Multi-Level Governance of Migration in Europe and Beyond, and also an ongoing ERC advanced research on youth radicalism among the nativist and Islamist youngsters living in Europe. So in the end, after I say a few words about the current state of right-wing radicalization, nativism, populism in Europe, I will also conclude my talk with their impact on the education of refugee children. So this is based on various different research, field research, conducted in different time intervals. So some are before the COVID-19 pandemic, and the last one, the RC research, which is taking place at the moment on the basis of in-depth interviews with several youngsters in places like Dresden, Lyon, Aalst in Belgium, and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This is taking place at the moment, so there are a lot of data which I have not yet processed completely about the pandemic, impact of the pandemic on on the construction of such borders. Just let me say a few words about the populist rhetoric. I think populist rhetoric at the moment in Europe is a kind of reactionary form of radicalization in the sense that Craig Calhoun talks about. Usually radicalization in Europe nowadays, as well as in different parts of the world nowadays, is simply reduced to Islamist forms of radicalism. However, I think this is a very reductionary and very problematic way of putting it, because radicalism might change from one place to another place. But basically, I take radicalization as a way of responding to the detrimental effects of modernization and globalization. So I don't take populism as a pathological stance. I take it as the outcome of the continuing socioeconomic, political, and psychological issues taking place in Europe over the last 3 decades. So I think populism is an outcome of the things happening, but not the reason of the existing problem. So we need to separate the symptoms from the root causes of the latest development. So I basically use social economic deprivation theories, as well as nostalgic deprivation theories from psychology discipline. And of course, populism at the moment in Europe, right-wing populism in Europe, is very much built upon anti-refugee positions, anti-immigrant positions, Islamophobia, and similar xenophobic, intersectional, racist perceptions, etc. So I'm not going to go into detail, but I want to share with you some of the interesting findings in the sense that they refer to the construction of some civilizational borders between different worlds. Europe is becoming more and more culturally Christian, but not religiously Christian. This is an important differentiation here, basically because of the successful manipulation, successful instrumentalization of the Islamophobic, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant discourses by the organized right-wing populist parties. So this is why Europe is becoming a bit more culturally and civilizationally Christian because of its anti-Muslim, Islamophobic set of sentiments. However, we also know that this clash is not really between the crescent and the cross, as it is argued by many. I argue that it is not really between the two, because these two are both Abrahamic religions. And the main divide, the main clash is actually on the basis of different lifestyles, mostly between the seculars, atheists, agnostics on the one hand, and the Islamists on the other hand. So it is a divide based on social life choices. And of course, global financial crisis and the refugee crisis, and lately the pandemic triggered these divides, because the pandemic has created a further precariousness among several different communities. On the one hand, it has created further detrimental elements for the poor, newly arrived refugee communities, as well as the settled working class origin migrant communities on the one hand, and those right-wing populist groups who live in the remote places that are forgotten, who live in the excluded places away from the capital cities. So that is why my research focuses on these remote places, which indicate similar socioeconomic parameters with the members of the refugee or migrant community. So I see quite interesting parallels, similarities between the socioeconomic status of the native population affiliated with right-wing populism on the one hand, and those Muslim origin, migrant origin people who become more and more Islamic religious as a response to this growing Islamophobia. So socioeconomically, they're quite actually similar. So this is the main hypothesis, and the hypothesis here is that those disenfranchised communities of people, both from native populations as well as Muslim origin populations, be it refugees or migrants, they are negatively being affected by the detrimental effects of globalization and modernization, but they respond differently to these problems. Some use their own cultural, national, and nativist repertoire, the natives, but the Muslims mainly use their religious repertoire to fight back against the effects, negative effects of this current processes. So, as I told you, I use the socioeconomic deprivation literature very much because we have quite a number of people who are relatively or in real terms being deprived, socioeconomically deprived, but also deprived nostalgically, because we come across a lot of people, native people, who live in those remote places, who have never left their remote places, who have a strong feeling that they are politically, socioeconomically, and culturally neglected by the mainstream political parties in the capital cities. So they are not simply against only the refugees or Muslims. They are against the state. They are actually anti-systemic in many different ways. So they have a problem with the fact that their former way of life is being challenged by all these different cosmopolitan, globalist forms of, changes, social changes. So it would be very reductionary to only call these people as anti-refugee or anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant, but they have actually deeper socioeconomic and psychological problems. So the scholars, social scientists, and the policymakers should have much better things to say, to do, simply calling these people a bunch of fascists or racists or anti-refugee or anti-Muslim people, because there is a lot to do there for the policy makers. And of course, this social economic deprivation and nostalgic deprivation need to be manipulated by some organized right-wing political parties. And unfortunately, at the moment, there are many organized right-wing political parties in Europe, starting with the Brexiteers or PVV in the Netherlands, or Le Pen in France, or AfD in Germany, etc. So here, the main rationale, the main discourse that they are using is that Europe is being colonized by Islam, by refugees who are not one of us. and those people who have the feeling that they are being left behind rather easily affiliate themselves with such politics of fear. So in order to use my time more efficiently, I just want to underline that these political parties are no longer extremist right-wing political parties. On the contrary, they are becoming more and more mainstream political parties, mainly because of their ability to use Islamophobic sentiments, or what I call Islamophobist ideology, to attract those social economically deprived people and nostalgically deprived people. So the conclusions in this sense are as follows. Due to this increasing right-wing populist sentiments in Europe, in 2015, as we all remember, the welcome culture was very much prevalent in Europe immediately after the death of Aylan Baby on the shores of Bodrum. However, this welcome approach is now being replaced by an hostile one. We have seen in many different interviews, again, conducted within the framework of Respond project, that this hostile climate is increasing. On the other hand, what we see in the European Union countries is that the migration management and asylum management policies are actually becoming more and more based on the idea of externalizing such policies regarding the management of migration and asylum. But on the other hand, they are becoming more and more renationalized rather than governed by a supranational European Union, setup. So this is why I think since mid-2000s, I think that this renationalization of migration and asylum policies are still continuing. And unfortunately, the latest EU Pact on Migration and Asylum is also confirming the renationalization of migration and asylum policies in Europe. Again, from the field research, we have seen, based on the interviews with the refugees, there is a very clear-cut understanding of or feeling of stuck in reception. The process of finalizing the asylum applications is a never-ending story. So that is why this is the way how many European states, including even Germany or even Sweden, are using this politics of deterrence to give some hard times to the refugees, so that the new refugees will not really come to their shores. So this means also that there is a protracted transition from reception to integration. So this is a never-ending period, transition period. And of course, all these debates, all these mental borders are creating further hurdles for the refugees and their children in terms of their access to education. And this is also being harmed by the protracted transition from reception to integration. And of course, there is also a growing debate about the unaccompanied and separated children and their disability to reach the educational services. And finally, a few words about the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, Deniz, and then I conclude. What I see here is that there is more securitization, which means that we will see more problems at the borders with the further empowerment of agencies such as Frontex. We will continue to see deals and statements like EU-Turkey deal and statement or similar deals with Libya and other countries, which is about the externalization of these policies. Renationalization, I talked about that, which is making things even more complicated in terms of the reconstruction of the borders, all kinds of borders, not only physical, but also mental borders. And finally, there's too much emphasis on return rather than integration of refugees. So then, based on this final EU pact, which is not yet, of course, finalized, I also can understand the growing emphasis in Turkey on return rather than integration. So with this, I will conclude. Thank you very much, Deniz.
Thank you, Ayhan. You took less time than you were allotted. Thank you. Well, our next speaker is Liz Fekete. Well, maybe I mispronounced your last name. Sorry about that.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, Liz is from the Institute of Race Relations and head of its European Research Program in London. And today she has worked a lot on issues of racism, fascism, refugee rights, Islamophobia in Europe. And today the title of her presentation is Intersectional Dimensions of Racism in the Aftermath of COVID-19. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And because Ayhan managed to speak less than he was allocated, I feel under great pressure. So hopefully I don't speak too quickly. Again, thanks to the organisers, particularly Ellen, Johanna, for organising this. I've done quite a few remote webinars, as I expect all of you have, and people who are coming, I expect you've been to a few as well. And one of the only good things I think that comes out of this is that we have an opportunity to talk much more across borders and have a transnational focus. So hello to my old friends on the panel, and I hope there's some old friends in the audience as well. And just thank the whole sort of technical side of this, Istanbul Policy Centre, because it seems really seamless at the moment. And I'm going to share my screen and I'm probably going to disrupt that seamlessness because I'm very backward at these sort of things. So just trying to get my slides up for you. Let's see whether I can find the right slideshow here and not do the last one, my last presentation. Let's have a look. Here we go, slides. So this is my organisation. We're an educational charity based in London, about to leave the EU in a few weeks' time. So thank you again for inviting somebody from a country who are so foolish as to leave the EU. So as Deniz said, I've been asked to talk about the intersectional dimensions of racism in the aftermath of COVID-19. But Johanna and Ellen also asked me to comment on the future of our economic neoliberal model and how racism and neoliberalism are combining. So what I'm going to do in my remaining time is I'm going to do three things actually. I'm also reading from a text because I have a tendency to ramble and I'm really worried about going over my time. So it's not my usual way of presentation, so forgive me for that. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to describe the current intersecting ways migrants, refugees, Roma, Black people, Muslim people in Europe are being treated during the pandemic. Second, I'm going to relate this back to our neoliberal economic model and its now more authoritarian turn. And finally, I'm going to ask how can we interrupt this authoritarian racism through education, the theme of this conference. And I was very pleased that Johanna mentioned the need to build strategies to tackle educational exclusion, but from a transnational perspective. And I think we've got an ideal opportunity here through the new transnational perspectives being thrown up by the transnational Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm going to finally talk about that, hopefully, if I don't run out of time. So let's just talk about the current situation. I think it was Ellen put it more eloquently than I can when she says that the pandemic and the lockdowns have placed great stress on all of us, but it hasn't affected us all equally. And that is very, very important to understand. I was just listening to a report on BBC News about domestic migrant workers in Spain. It was a horrific report. Many of them have been locked in their houses by abusive employees through the whole lockdown, sexually harassed, etc. Their freedom of movement has been curtailed. And that's the first point about the unequal aspects of the pandemic, because there have been far more restrictive regulations on freedom of movement on migrants and refugees living in camps, migrant workers like domestic workers or agricultural workers, as well as the Roma, who in Eastern Europe in particular live in ghetto conditions. So I think it's an important point that I want to underline here. It's important that we use the right vocabulary to describe what's going on, because it's not ordinary lockdown for great masses of people. So it's a much more severe lockdown that these populations are experiencing. When the military build separation walls and guard checkpoints with guns, when drones with thermal sensors are used to remotely take the temperature of residents in Roma settlements, or even in one case, a whole village is sprayed with disinfectant from crop dusters, then we are not talking about proportionate coronavirus-related restrictions, but about targeted quarantine and militarized confinement. Just going to try and move on to my next, I can't do it. Yeah. So some of the things that I'm talking about here are in a series of very good reports, Amnesty International, European Roma Rights Centre. So going back to the whole issue of the camps, the next speaker is going to talk far more eloquently than me about the situation in Lesbos, particularly what happened in the Moria camp, where the residents were placed under repeated restrictions. But I want to give you another example, this time from Italy. In Italy, 8 commercial ferries have been contracted to quarantine refugees who arrive on boats. The conditions on these ferries are deplorable, and they lack basic medical equipment, even though people are meant to be there to be quarantined in case of coronavirus. We know that 4 refugees have died since April on these ferries, and that includes two children, two teenagers have died. 15-year-old Abu Diakite from the Ivory Coast was taken to a quarantine ship, even though he was severely malnourished when he was rescued off the coast of Sicily. He had signs of torture on his body. He became seriously ill and was eventually transferred to a hospital where he fell into a coma and died. So that's what's happening in the camps and to new arrivals. And that's what's happening in the Roman settlement. But this discriminatory treatment also intersects with our long history of racial profiling and racist policing in Europe. I would say that there's a policing towards the camp, an exceptional policing that has developed towards the camp, but there is also a domestic territorial policing which is discriminatory. The intersectionality is also because Black communities, poor working class Black communities, brown communities, migrant communities tend to live in the poorer multicultural working class neighborhoods of Europe. And this is where we are seeing saturation policing and excessive use of force during the lockdown. I'll give you two examples from the UK. There are many more examples, particularly from France and Belgium. We have a system in the UK where the police can stop and search young people primarily, but stop and search anyone on the streets. In some cases, they don't have to have grounds for that stop and search. They can just have a generalized suspicion. Young black men tend to be disproportionately stopped on the search on the streets even before lockdown. But what we saw this year, that a massive increase in lockdown in London, 40% increase in stop and searches during lockdown. So there were 104,914 stop and searches between April and June this year, equating to more than 1,100 stops a day. And another recent report from the UK found the police were up to 7 times more likely to fine black people for breaches of lockdown than white people. I want to go to the second part of my talk, which is to relate this back to neoliberalism. The pandemic has once again shown up the failures of the neoliberal model, its tendency to abandon its populations. What is neoliberalism? It's a project to shrink the state by privatizing state assets, in particular to sell off aspects of the welfare state. Everything is left up to the market. The market is God under neoliberalism. And the market is a global market. That's what we mean by globalization, the integration of all countries in the world into global circuits of capital, which is instrumented through its handmaiden, the market state. But this market has glossed over the misery it has caused to people, particularly through austerity. Neoliberalism hides behind a veneer that it's there for individuals. It's a philosophy that allows individuals to rise up in what they describe as our meritocracies, our post-racial meritocracies. As long as you're flexible enough and you believe in hard work, you can rise to the top. It's a myth. And it's a myth that is also imposed on the developing world. We are protected in Europe from the harm we create around the world through our proxy wars, our economic policies. Once again, neoliberalism blames the people. We are told that the post-colonial states have failed to integrate into the global economy. They are failed states. And the people who are forced out of those states are seen as failed individuals, even though they are often escaping the wars that we are propagating, or our environmental destruction. They are portrayed as deluded individuals pulled to Europe through our generous welfare system. The world is divided between us and them, civilizational racism, as Ayhan has told us. But these insider-outsider narratives are now strengthened by the portrayal of the them as the carriers of disease. So what we're seeing now is that the whole division of the world between us and them is replicated in the way that we treat migrants as a public health risk to be quarantined from the rest of society. So we see a further round of public policy proposals based on more dehumanization, more militarization, more territorial policing. And Ayhan has already mentioned the EU Asylum and Migration Pact, which is going to further the kind of agreements that we saw with the EU-Turkey agreement. They want this to become the new norm of offshore processing of migrants and refugees so they cannot set foot in Europe. The idea is to create a world where refugees live in tent cities, where children grow into adults without any possibility of integration into the social life of a so-called host country. One of the themes of this conference is how can we get governments to keep refugee children safe? But we can't keep children safe unless we stop the structural violence that is being deployed against them. Oh, wrong way. I talk about a lot of this stuff that I've been talking about neoliberalism in a book I published a couple of years ago called Europe's Fault Lines. And this is also a global call for a global pact of solidarity for the rights of migrants and refugee peoples, which is one initiative against the structural violence that we are facing. So the whole hysteria around outsiders. I mean, I know that a lot of you will know what's happening in the Mediterranean Sea, but you may not know so well what is happening in the UK, a French situation around the Channel, where in a couple of weeks, the Institute of Race Relations, together with our friends in the Permanent People's Tribunal, will be bringing out a new report on deadly crossings and the militarization of the Channel. This documents nearly 300 cases from 1990 where people have died trying to get from France to the UK. Most of these are young people. And tragically, it includes a case from 2 weeks ago when Anita, aged 8, and Armin, aged 5, died of heart failure after their fishing boat they were traveling in capsized in the English Channel. Now, I'm going to quickly go to the concluding remarks on education. So all this militarization, all this exclusion, we don't need to give up. You know, the troops are arriving. There are new perspectives coming. And in many ways, I think that this neoliberal abandonment of people is about to see its nemesis. Because if the states abandon the people will organize themselves. Sparks are flying everywhere. In the US, the Movement for Black Lives have produced important documents that give us a road back to a better world. Abolitionism, the defund, divest approach to law and order, entails rejecting a world which characterized people as a threat. You know, the English Channel, we have a specially appointed commander for mitigating the threat in the English Channel. So from the start, people are described as a threat, not as a humanitarian issue. So abolition entails rejecting the language of threat and seeing people as a resource. It means creating a new framework around issues of education, justice, rights and fairness in the labour market. Abolitionism involves imagining a society where things are organised differently, where education, rehabilitation, integration, healing become the responses to interlocking global crises. Central to the abolitionist cause is the demand to defund the police and invest in social services. It is a demand that recognises that we can't just patch up the system that we live under, and we can't just abolish. We have to build, as to abolish without building leaves us vulnerable. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means we could take the money away from law and order and redirect it downstream. Just imagine the Italian government, each of those 8 ferries it has commissioned costs €1 million a month to run. Just imagine what we could do with that money if we ploughed it into education, into mental health, into funding youth clubs, into taking torture victims to a place of safety, into ensuring unaccompanied children are fully integrated into education, including university education. Oh, wrong way again. God help me. I recently wrote a...
Sorry, you have a few minutes left.
I'm nearly finished. I recently wrote a piece for this, for our website about abolitionism. Maybe one conclusion from this conference would be to take all our findings and apply them to an abolitionist perspective. Recognising that neoliberalism has abandoned migrant and refugee children means that we need to protect them. But as I said, and I've got 2 more comments, we can't abolish unless we build. And if we are to build community safety for our children, we have to start from the simple premise. As the founder of my organisation said, there is no such thing as your children and my children. There are only children. At the moment, education reflects the status quo and prepares children for a future that is imposed on them. Young people must be at the forefront of change. We must create a bridge from this failed world to the other side.
Okay, Liz, thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. So our and also thanks for keeping well, definitely under the time allotted for you. I mean, finishing under the time allotted for you. Well, our next speaker is Zachariah Farzad, who's a human rights activist who was born in Kabul, Afghanistan, and actually spent a year in the Moria refugee camp in Greece. And I think currently he's involved in a project called Wave of Hope for the Future, which is a refugee an educational initiative for refugee children. And today, the title of his presentation is Education in the Midst of an Emergency, Approaches and Current Challenges on the Political and Societal Levels. The floor is yours, Zachariah.
Thank you very much. Good evening, all. First, I want to say the thanks for this opportunity that we can share our knowledge and learn more to be aware about the situation now beyond borders and our daily life as a refugee and as a human in this world of many crises. World many crises and world politic games that it has a direct impact for creation of all these crises, unfortunately. And I am very happy that as a refugee, I have this opportunity to be in amongst you honorable teachers and professors. And I'm Zachariah Farzad from Afghanistan, as Madam introduced before, and I am a refugee amongst all those difficulties that you are thinking or about and research about refugee crisis. And for your information, I was an activist and a journalist in Afghanistan, and a founder of A Wave of Hope for the Future, schools and refugee camps in Greece, starting as an initiative, and now it is in a very short time. WHF is a famous, helpful, and useful institution. And we registered that as an NGO in Italy by support of some friends and those people that they are thinking about humanity and about all these crises. And we have 6 schools and 6 refugee camps in Greece, and we have 2 construction of schools for children in rural areas in Afghanistan. And we have different classes in Greece, especially different classes of languages, music, art, and we have some other projects like WHF COVID-19 awareness team, and we have other activities, kids activities, and different distribution and other activities on the ground. As a refugee, that I lived more than 1 year in the Moria refugee camp, and it's a notorious refugee camp that everyone knows about, and it is most of the time it is on the top of the title of the news. And we had a very good project in Moria refugee camp, and we had a school, and we had more than 2,700 students and more than 60 teachers there from different nations and different countries, and with lots of difficulties that I had in the camp, and as a refugee, and I lived with my 5 children under a tent, and we started these schools when I surveyed and I checked around, and I found that there's no schools for the children, and I started this, and with lots of challenges that I faced in front of myself. The government, the police, the camp authorities, they were against me, that you're a refugee and you must know yourself that you're just a refugee and you don't have you don't have the responsibility to have to make a structure of a school here. And after lots of negotiation and arguing with the authorities and police, they allowed me to start the school with a commitment and signed a commitment. Unfortunately, later I received 3 rejections, 3 refused from my asylum application, that it makes lots of difficulties for me. And now I'm living alone here in Switzerland, and my family is still there living in Athens illegally. It is the challenges that still I am struggling to fight against all these inequality system, and that I did so many activities for so many peoples, and I brought lots of smiles in so thousands faces, but unfortunately I am stuck here and I can't do something for my own family. And Wave of Hope established on May 2019, at the middle of May. And as a refugee, I want to tell you my own witnesses that I had lived there, and I passed there, and I feel all those difficulties that the people has got in Moria refugee camp and other refugee camps that I met, and I have contact with all my colleagues. Yeah, I know. I know the different. I am aware of the current difficult situation in the world, and also in Greece, and regarding the COVID-19 outbreak. We are part of this society, and we adhere to the measures for our own and others' protections, treated as all. We do have our best to follow the guidelines of the government, but it is evident that it is impossible to do that in this confined and non-hygienic environment of this extremely overcrowded camp. In this crucial period of time, we want to express our solidarity to the health staff working all over the world, and we would like to give our condolences to all those families that they lost their loved ones from the virus. This global pandemic actually resembles a war being forced out of our countries because of war. We recognize very well the solidarity and everyday fight the medical staff is giving to save lives. They are heroes. This is the reason we feel the responsibility to inform the wider public that there are many as doctors and health professionals among us that the state and the country could mobilize and allow them to join the fight and strengthen our society's defenses against these common threats. On the other hand, we want to express our disappointment for being regarded as invaders. We didn't want to leave our homelands. But the world politic games, and we were forced to flee by actual invaders and became refugees and asylum seekers. We came here in Europe, in a country where democracy began. We came here to seek protection and an environment where human rights matter. We came to Europe, a continent which is famous for its asylum system and respect of human rights values. We feel the responsibility to inform you once more that the living conditions in the camp are inhuman. To say the least, and getting worse every day. We are afraid, particularly during this period of COVID-19, that we will probably end up in the middle of a humanitarian crisis that will not only affect us, but the rest of society too. Many of us are already vulnerable, like women and children, elderly people, those with special needs and people with serious health problems. We are really afraid for our lives that we were able to protect so far from wars, a very dangerous journey, and people looking to exploit us, traffickers, if you will. It would be a pity for us to lose our lives here, as well as affecting the whole society. Since we are not sure if you're informed of the actual conditions in the camp, we would like to underline some of the major difficulties we face on a daily basis. The camp is extremely overcrowded, and especially after this fire in Moria refugee camp, that the people relocated to a new camp in a firing training center. They made temporary camps with lots of difficulties. There is no security for to protect themselves. The refugees protect themselves from the storm, from the rain, from the snow, and now the old weather is coming, and all these stuff. There are people held inside a closed detention center.
Zachariah?
Yes.
Yeah, you have. I just want to say you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I want to just tell the important stuffs and the difficulties of people, and I will finish this. Yeah. We have the camp, the lack of proper information in general, but especially now during the COVID-19 outbreak, fake news is always dominating the camp. The lack of proper information in general, but especially now during the COVID-19 outbreak, fake news, I read this repeatedly, sorry. Residents are not feeling safe. The lack of security has made life difficult for us. The police are not interfering, and if they do not solve the situation. There are lots of violences, there are lots of fightings, different cultures, different nations, different religions. most of the time there are many violences, even we had some injured, and we had some dead refugees, that it is very important that still we have all these problems in the camp. It is the things that I wrote it from the witnesses now that I want to explain to you guys. The shortage of sanitation products and water supply, lack of food, at least 500 people daily do not receive food portions. The shortage of medical staff and the difficulty to access health services, lack of access to medical supplies. People who are trapped in the camp for years, waiting for their asylum interviews, leading to mental health issues, especially those who are most vulnerable. There are people held inside a closed detention center before it was in Moria, but now it is in Mytilene. There are people held inside closed detention. We are really afraid of their health, especially now with the COVID-19 outbreak. Priority must be given to vulnerable groups of people like women and unaccompanied children, the elderly, and people with health problems and disabilities that must be evacuated from the camp as soon as possible. Now there is the second lockdown, and unfortunately we have to close our school, but our awareness team, COVID-19 awareness team, are active on the ground, and they have lots of activities and distribution. Especially we distribute hygienic stuffs and many other things for the winter, especially warm clothes for the children and these stuff. And I thank you very much from all of you. I think it is okay for this time that I had. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Zachariah. Our fourth and final presenter is Mohamed Jouni, and Mohamed Jouni is a social worker at the BBZ Center, a center for advice and care for young refugees and migrants in Berlin. He's also a board member of the Federal Association of Unaccompanied Refugee Minors in Germany, and also is part of other initiatives regarding refugee children. So today he will speak on voices of refugees against structural discrimination in education in the context of changing political and societal discourses. The floor is yours, Mohamed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Unfortunately, my camera on my laptop is not working, so that's why I'm twice in the panel now. So I'm choosing here the camera on my phone and here my laptop to show you my slides. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really very happy to be here today and to report on our work and to exchange the ideas with you. I thank the previous speakers for their very valuable input. And I hope I can keep the time, inshallah. Inshallah is now also a German word, by the way. So it is this is a very nice thing of integration. I will give you a practical insight into our practical political work of a self-organization. At the beginning, I will explain a little bit what obstacles and exclusions and discriminations refugee children experience in the German education system. And then I will tell you about the group of Youth Without Borders, which is a self-organization, and I will do some insights in our campaigns. I will start my slides. Yeah, and by the way I wanted to tell that I met Liz 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago in Berlin when she was here and was also making a research. And yeah, and actually we talk about the same things like today. It was also about the education system and about the discrimination in the asylum system and educational system. So nice to meet you once more after 10 years, Liz. Sorry, I don't know what happened now. Now. Yeah. So refugee students are, as you maybe know, are affected by educational discrimination, and of course, long before the Corona pandemic. And during the pandemic, these exclusions and these problems young people faces increased. So the students are affected by structural and institutional discrimination. They not only experience racism like anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism, and racism against Roma people in school, but also they are affected by structural racism and classism. Many of them are forced to live in live on social benefits, which are sometimes below the subsistence level, especially if they are rejected asylum seekers. These are so-called tolerated people. We say in Germany they have a Duldung. A Duldung means that they are only tolerated and they have to leave the country. Some people live with this toleration status 1 year, 10 years, sometimes over 20 years if people are not get deportated. So they will stay in this status for a long time. This toleration status means that people are banned from school. Sometimes they are not allowed to attend school. They are usually banned from working after school, and they are not allowed to start vocational training or vocational education. They are not allowed to study after that, and they are they live in an environment which is really very learning unfriendly. They live in campaigns, in camps. Sorry, they live in camps. They often have no access to the internet. They don't have access to hardware, etc. The school system in Germany, and I think it is also in different countries the same. The school system in Germany is often based on the fact that parents have to support a lot, and often the parents they cannot afford this because the school does not involve them in decision making. These parents are getting neglected, or they are invisible actually in the school. Sometimes the parents, they don't speak enough German, or sometimes parents don't have also themselves formal high education qualifications, so they cannot really support their children. When children are enrolled in school, this usually happens in a segregation system. That means that they are taught in extra classes or sometimes also in extra schools. I would like to show you just one this is a very famous magazine, the Spiegel, and they were talking about, so we were calling these schools apartheid schools because actually they are not something different than apartheid schools. And this very famous magazine were talking in 2018 about if it is good to have apartheid schools or not. Just imagine, they are not saying that these schools are bad. They are talking about if they are bad or not. Sometimes the teachers and the government use these segregation schools to say it is good for the students to learn German. So they changed the names of these classes. Sometimes they are so-called Ausländerklassen, so classes for foreigners. Sometimes they call them German learning classes. Sometimes they name them welcome classes. So they have different names, but actually they are only segregation system of schooling. Yeah, so even if this segregation is actually thought to be temporary, the reality shows us that the students stayed there for very, very, very long time. And as maybe you have heard, the Germans are actually worldwide very known for being very precise, very accurate work. And the Germans have standards for everything, standards for, I don't know, for trees, for cucumbers, for everything. But for the so-called welcome classes, there are no standards. There are no uniform curricula. There are no uniform standards. So every school, every teacher can make experiments and can practice their learning by doing. So I can go further now and explain more discriminations, but I don't want to do that, and I will tell you more about our work in Youth with Borders, what we do. So maybe, yeah. I by myself, I came to Germany more than 20 years ago, and I experienced exactly these discriminations and exclusions by myself. Today, I work as a social worker in a counseling center and experience that young people who flee to Germany in 2020, they are facing the same problems sometimes like me 20 years ago. In 2005, I was about to finish my school, and I went to the counseling center where I work now as a social worker to find out what I can do after the school. And there, the social worker explained me that after the school, I will not have any possibilities to continue. I'm not allowed to go to university, for example. And in the same time, he told me that this is affected by, or the reason is that there are laws, and laws are not the Bible or the Quran or something like that. That these laws, of course, they are written by politicians, and these can also be changed. So I get together with other young people who were affected by the same problem like me, and we founded the initiative Youth Without Borders. With this initiative, we wanted to draw attention to the living conditions of young refugees, even, and we have committed ourselves to following goals. So we said from the beginning, we said the society must recognize us as not as affected people only. We are experienced experts. You are not allowed to talk about us without us. We want a right to stay for everybody who is living in Germany. We demand a real implementation of the UN, of the CRC, of the Children's Rights Convention, which means all children are same. There is no difference between white children, black children, refugee children, etc. We want equal rights for refugees, especially on the topic of labor market, access to education, etc. And we want more spaces for self-organization through self-empowerment. So these were our goals from the beginning, and to achieve these goals we have conducted many campaigns. Most of them they were around the theme of education. So we had a campaign which was called Mein Zeugnis für Merkel, or like my school testimony for Angela Merkel. We collected more than 300 school testimonials from students who had this tolerated status, and we sent them to the chancellor and said, look, you are talking the whole time about integration and that people have to integrate. These people have done their homeworks. and they are not having any opportunity to stay here. Give these people the opportunity to stay here. So we know and we are aware that in this campaign, for example, we are partly used neoliberal and classist vocabulary. We know this because actually also so every party can also support us. We say, look, we are the nurses from the future. We are your worker from the future. But even though in these campaigns we use this to hold up a mirror to the society and to show that this is a lie, that the narrative of integrate yourself, that everything is gonna be fine, that this is a lie. There are people, and integration is a lie, because there are a lot of people who can integrate as much as they want. They will never have an opportunity to stay in Germany and to plan their future in Germany. The same was another campaign, which was Bildungslos. And what we also do, we organize meetings with politicians. We organize yearly since 2005. We organize conferences parallel to the conference of the Interior Minister, where young refugees can offer and can take part on workshops. We make public demonstrations, and we make every year a sarcastic action, which is called the election of the Minister of Deportation for the best deportator of Germany, and to show the society in Germany what is really going on. So we started 2005. You have to imagine 2005, nobody wanted to talk about refugee. It was a very, very, very special topic. Now everybody is talking about refugees like we are doing, but 2005, nobody wanted to talk about that. So I will just show you some photos from our actions. And maybe one very interesting remark. This I don't know if you can see it.
But hi, Mohammed.
Yeah.
By the way, you have a few minutes left.
Okay, I will be finished. I don't know if you can see, but this in a research project, we found out that the same poster, like this one, with the 11 and the 19 down right, the same post. We found out that the same poster with similar words was already used in the AIDS by Turkish Parents Association in demonstration, which is also a proof for the continuity of racism in the educational system in Germany. So last thing, I'm doing now some advertisement. We wrote last year, we wrote a book which is called Between Barriers, Dreams and Self-Organization, Experiences of Young Refugees. We have done, and I had the opportunity to support this process of writing this book. So young people wrote about different topics, about schools, friendships, parents, and a lot of things. And yeah, it was really a very, very, very intense process of writing. And at the end, I will like to give you the sentence from this book. One of the writers said it was bad. The German girls and boys, they said so many bad words about the refugees, and I was alone from another country, and I understood, but I couldn't answer, and I shouldn't answer. I couldn't do anything. I didn't want to be in this class again. My welcome class was better, 100 times better than the regular class. So actually, we are against this segregation, but people are sometimes for this special classes because they face so much racism in their regular. Okay, thank you. I hope that I didn't took a lot of time.
Thank you, Mohammed. You didn't take a lot of time. Actually, everybody, I thank all 4 of the panelists for finishing their presentations within the time allotted for them. Thank you very much to all 4 of you. Okay, we have a couple of questions so far. Let me see if I can read them. So one question is directed to Ayhan Kaya. So the question is, how would you reflect upon the social class dimension of Islamophobia? Is it exclusive to the local working class people who have been systematically excluded from the labor market and lose their status parallel to the deindustrialization? Or is it common to intersocial classes in Europe? How would you reflect on this issue? So this is a question for Ayhan Kaya. And well, Ayhan, you can answer, then I will go ask the other question. In the meantime, for the attendees, please, you are free to write your questions in the chat box, but please indicate to whom your question is directed.
Thank you, Deniz. Çetin, the answer to this question is a rather complicated one, and it's a long one, but I'll make it very short. Of course, mostly those working class origin people who have been suffocated by the neoliberal forms of governance and deindustrialization processes in Europe over the last 3 decades are more affiliated with this Islamophobic sentiments. It's not necessarily because they are anti-Islam or anti-Muslim, but mainly they are actually opposed to those social groups who are their competitors because they're coming from the same similar social economic status. This was the information that this was the knowledge that we had earlier, and this is still the case. But lately, there is also something new happening, and right-wing populist parties are also, in order to mainstream themselves, are approaching middle class and upper middle class people who are mostly coming from, secular based groups, and right-wing populist parties using the Islamophobic discourse very well, very effectively, to attract such groups of people who are afraid, who have a fear of the Muslims challenging their life, their forms of life. And among these groups, we also see a growing number of LGBTI groups of people, and even Jewish communities are appealing themselves to the Islamophobic discourses. So this is why I say Europe is becoming culturally more Christian because of this growing Islamophobia. And one thing more to add to the things that I just said is that mostly those people who are more agnostic, atheist, secular, laicist, are likely to become Islamophobic. And one last thing that I need to underline, of course, educated people and even women are less Islamophobic. They have less Islamophobic tendencies. And one thing more, I think Islamophobia has become a mainstream discourse, which is being tactically used by so many different groups of people to draw attention of Berlin, of Brussels, of Washington, of the world capital cities, because if they just use a social economic discourse to talk about their relative or real deprivation, no one is going to pay attention to them. But they know very well that if they use this Islamophobic discourse, the whole world is going to focus on them. And I think they're using this very tactically and very successfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayhan, for your response to this very complicated issue, as you pointed out. Okay, here's a question and also an expression of thanks from an attendee. Thank you all for this great webinar. We've learned a lot. You've talked about how governments and institutions treat refugees and what they should do, but I'd like to ask a simpler question. What can we do in our daily lives as individuals? How can we make people understand that the world is but one country and people and its citizens? And is there anything that the pandemic has taught us about how to treat people? And this question actually is addressed to all panelists or any panelist who wants to answer it. And then I want to read another question. Now, this question is for the first three panelists. That is Ayhan, Liz, and Zachariah. Can you go a little more into depth on how you assess the role of and access to education for refugee children with regard to their respective perspective in your talk? Well, let me simplify this. Can you go a little bit more into how you assess the role of and access to education for refugee children? So this is for the first three panelists. Okay, so okay, Liz wants to go first. Okay.
I'll try and answer quickly because I'm aware of the questions and Maria has to also come in. So very quickly, I would say that the role of education or the denial of access to refugee children, particularly university education, higher education, has to be related back to the neoliberal model and then has to be related back to the functional way that people are treated as economic units in that neoliberal model. So I would say that it links to the whole fact that a neoliberal state is shrinking the welfare state and it's shrinking access to education. So refugee children can become almost like the guinea pigs. And the exclusion is a prelude to exclusion of other groups. But secondly, I think it's related to the whole issue of control. I mean, the example that Zachariah gave was just so painful about how in the camps, they don't want to allow teachers in those camps to set up a school. So it's about controlling people so much that there is no access to integration, there is no access to trying in simple ways to build a different world in the camp. So it's the labour market and control and neoliberalism, basically.
Thank you. And I think Mohammed wants to say something on this issue, and then Ayhan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about the question, what can people do as individuals? And I think this is really very, very difficult because as I said, it is not an individual problem, it is a structural problem, it is an institutional problem. But what I can tell you, when I make workshops, for example, for teachers, for social workers who work in school, at school, I always tell them how important their work is. I talked a lot to refugees who had later, like me, for example, the opportunity to go to the university and to have good testimonials, and they always remembered a certain teacher. They said, this teacher was very, very, very good. This teacher told me you can do it. this teacher told me, don't leave what is written in your papers. This teacher was sensitive for racism. These teachers were aware for discrimination, and they talked with me about this. So there is also there are also opportunities on the individual level for people who are working with the people directly to not to reproduce racism, or to be focused on the problem of the people.
Yeah,
thank you.
Deniz, thank you for I think Semih Chapar's question. I also want to add something based on the observations in different countries, the Netherlands, Germany, Turkey, Sweden, especially referring to the work of Krul and his friends from the Netherlands in 2018. They observed that countries like Turkey, Germany, and the Netherlands have a very strong instrumentalist view of the refugees and migrants in general, trying to integrate them into the labor market as cheap labor force when they graduate. So you know Deniz very well as well from the Turkish context that there is this obsession in Turkey about the German educational model, which is actually a very problematic model, a very class-based model, which discriminates against the migrants and the refugees for sure. But on the other hand, when you look at the Swedish model, it seems to be more egalitarian, giving the equal access, right to equal access to the refugees and the migrants to have access to education. So we need to be in favor of such a paradigm, taking the refugees as equal youngsters of refugee and migration origin as equal people. So this is, I think, a really interesting debate that we need to also take into consideration when we talk about the education, access of the refugees to educational sector. Thank you.
Okay, now there's a question for Zachariah from Joanna, actually. Zachariah, this is for you. We all know that the old Moria camp, the refugee camp, has been tragically burned down. The school which you and other refugees built in the Moria camp in order to provide basic education for children has been also burnt down. You said that all the schools are closed now due to coronavirus. The focus on Lesbos lies now rather than humanitarian aid. But what would you say to the international community now in order to rebuild the school? Or how can you and other refugees be supported in order to rebuild your work, your school?
Thank you very much from the questioner. First, I want to respond to the first question about the individual people, that what's their responsibility. I think as Mohammed said, it is not an individual difficulty or an individual problem. It is the whole world problem, and the world must stand beside the people that they are in crisis, especially refugees, and beside and also the activists who are really want to offer education in especially emergency educations in emergency conditions. That we did this as a refugee, that we lived under a tent in a very bad condition of life. We stand beside refugees because the government doesn't didn't make any school or public school for the refugees, for the refugee children. Some of small organizations that they provided some educational activities for the children. We must be the voice of the people. We must be the voice of those innocent people that they are living in a very inhuman conditions. And at the last time, I want to say all the world people that it is, according to the question, that a saying of Rumi that he says that raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that makes the flowers, not thunder. It is all our responsibility, individuals and those people that they are thinking about humanity and human rights, and especially the very important right of a human is education, especially children. About my school, that it has burned during the fire. Fortunately, we started struggling, and we started to do something for the refugees there as a very useful educational center. Finally, we could find a space for our school, and we built it, and we had some activities, and we started our classes from last month until now, but it's about 3 days that it is the second lockdown for the camps. But unfortunately, there is a difference also between humans from the Greece government, because the public schools of the Greek people are open for the children. Still, they are going to school, but they closed all our activities for the children of refugee children. And it is another point that it is very, it shows that differently of equality for humanities. That now we have to close, because they pushed that when we are closing the camp and no one can go out, and the school must be closed. And I have a message to the whole world, especially those international organizations and communities that they are active in this kind of activities. I ask them that there are many difficulties in new refugee camp in Moria, and Moria 2, actually. Education is the most important. And our school brought a very good impact in their daily life. Actually, the psychologists and they are advising people to be calm, to be relaxed because of different traumatic mentally problems. But we did in action by ourselves, by our own community, with lots of difficulties. They must learn about that a refugee, that he or she doesn't have anything, just they have feeling that as a human, they are standing beside the refugees, and they are starting in many initiatives. And after that I started these initiatives for the first time, lots of other refugees, they started different classes in different parts of the camps. And it is a ring of alarm of something that we encourage the people that we must do something for ourselves as a refugee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zachariah. We have here, I see 2 more questions, and I think we have barely enough time for both of them. So one question is from Ellen to all panelists. how can governments be held more accountable for the lack of compliance with the right to education and non-discrimination against children and adolescents? What measures are needed at the local, national, and international level? So how can governments be held more accountable for the lack of compliance with the right to education? So that's Ellen's question. And then Lisa Rosen has a question directed to Ayhan Kaya. You spoke about the power and effect of sentiments that populist parties use as a proxy to underpin their exclusionary and racist policies in education and beyond, while the migrants' voices are silenced. What actors need to come together to turn these feelings around and take away the sounding board of anti-Muslim narrative? I wonder which actors are contributing to and supplementing the gain of their explanatory power in Europe. Is it only right-wing populist parties, or do other political parties' omission of humanitarian action also contribute to this? There's another question for Mohammed, but I don't think we have much time, so I will ask for short answers from the participants so that we can have enough time for Maria's comments on all 4 papers. So this is the question is concerning the intersections with the migrant youth experiences and the connection between current integration and education policies in Germany. Do you think it is possible to reconceptualize, rethink integration through migrant and refugee children's experience within the German education system? Okay, so the question, 2 questions are for Ayhan and Mohammed, and 1 question for everyone, but please very brief answers because we have a little time left. So Ayhan, do you want to go first?
Very quickly, Deniz, without taking too much time. Lisa, that's a great question. Islamophobia or migrant phobia or even racism is a form of governmentality. And the current right-wing populist parties are not the only ones using this form of governmentality, which is Islamophobia. Let's go back to mid-2000s, 2010. Let's remember what Angela Merkel said about multiculturalism, what David Cameron talked about multiculturalism, or Sarkozy talked about multiculturalism. They were all very anti-multiculturalist, very right-wing, conservative, and Islamophobic, speeches. So today, it's not the mainstream political parties maybe using this Islamophobic discourse, but certainly right-wing populist parties. So this means that right-wing populist parties at the moment are building their discourse on already existing Islamophobic discourses, the fundamentals of which were erected by the mainstream political parties. So we are talking about the systemic problem here, which is always scapegoating the minorities, autochthonous minorities, Muslims, migrants, refugees, etc., right? So this is number one. And so where is the remedy? I think, to be honest, I don't really expect remedies from the states, from the institutions of the majority society. I expect the remedies coming from within the Muslim origin, migrant origin, refugee origin communities, individuals who need to come up with their own organic intellectuals to represent themselves in the public space. So let's remember in the 2000s, after the 9/11, when Islamophobia was having its heydays in those days, it was really interesting to also see that the remedy was coming by itself, thanks to the political mobilization of Muslim origin, elite to come forward to represent those communities in the national parliament, European Parliament, and local parliament. So my hunch is that the crisis situations create their own windows of opportunities, and I strongly believe that new individuals, new political actors will come from within these communities to say something different, to bridge between the majorities and the minorities. This is what I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed?
Okay, I will try it very briefly.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope that I understood the question in the right way, and I think it is really a very complicated one. We will take maybe one day to answer for that. So I think the school system in Germany is one of the most complicated fields in the politics. Actually, Maria know that actually all education policymakers have failed in reforms. We have 16 federal states with sometimes totally different education system and education laws. Nevertheless, but I think a lot of things are changing. The curriculum of the teachers when they study is changing very, very slowly. There is a rethinking of integration. A lot of politicians don't use more the term of integration. They are using participation, empowerment. There are a lot of workshops for teachers, for policymakers. So things are changing. I don't want to be very pessimist, but it is very, very slowly. So it's not for this generation. So my daughter is now in the school, and I think she will not have the perfect school system, but maybe her children. So I am very hopeful if I say her children.
Okay, Liz. I think Liz is raising her hand. Liz, go ahead.
Very quickly, in terms of how do we hold governments to account, I'm a bit cynical about legal measures and strategic measures. We have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We live in a tick box society where governments say they abide by the convention. They're just tick boxes, but they take the heart and soul out of it. I go back to the question from the person who says, is there anything that the pandemic has taught us about how to treat people? I have a bit of a different take on the question. I think there isn't a role for the individual. I think it's a very, very good question. And it's about solidarity. It's about the role that the individual can play in creating new structures in society to create solidarity.
Thanks, Liz. So if there are no further responses from the panelists, I will now give the floor to Maria. Professor Maria Domar Castro Varela is a professor of social work at the Alice Solomon University in Berlin, and she works on critical education and critical migration studies, and she will now comment on all four contributions. The floor is yours, Maria.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you also again to the organizers, especially Johanna and Ellen. Ellen also for inviting me to try to give a comment on all the papers here, which is quite a difficult task. Thanks to Ayhan, Liz, Zachariah, and Mohammed for all their very interesting insights in the topic and very, very complex presentations. I think in what follows, I will not be able to, of course, do justice to the very elaborate papers because I only have 10 minutes. So I beg your pardon for that in beforehand already. But I think that the topic is a very, very important topic, but it is also, of course, very, how to put it, it's very complex because we have like three different things that we try to address in one go. One is the politics of migration and refugees. Then we have the topic of multiple crises that we are like going through globally. not only in Europe, but globally. We have a financial crisis, which is ongoing, and we will have a very deep recession after the pandemia is like, if we in any time are through this pandemia. We have a climate crisis, and we have, but also a crisis concerning refugees and migrations. So we could say that we are living really in trying times for all of us. And the pandemic might be seen as a crisis as such, but a crisis is not the same than a catastrophe. A crisis seems can always be a challenge which offers a lot of possibilities. And I think the biggest possibilities that opens up with the pandemic is to rethink a lot of practices, ideas, and strategies maybe we have tried in the last maybe 100 years, because history is repeating itself. Mohammed said it in his introduction, and I found that very nice to Liz. We saw each other 10 years ago, and we were talking about the same things. So people are saying, oh, these are new things that are happening. Actually, they're not. Actually, we have a continuity of politics, of marginalization, of racism, and also of anti-Semitism in the whole of in the whole world, actually, but with very different faces to it. And I think that education is a keystone to address this different crises and the very trying time that we are going through right now. That's why I think it's very interesting to really focus on education. Interestingly enough, for I think the majority of the people, education is something that is like not the most interesting topic in the world. They would think that you have to address marginalization or all different crises, be it the climate crisis, be it the financial crisis, all through political doing, you know, through the governments. But I think that this is only one part of it. If we don't address and focus on education, the history will repeat itself ad nauseum. You know, it will come again and again to the same point. So we have to address that. And that's why I want to emphasize that we have to not only talk about the structure of education, because it's very clear that the way the education, the idea, the main idea of education, which is still in the West, and I would also claim globally, humanist idea of education. And we have to see what that in the heart of this humanist idea of education, it was always education set up for an elite. It was never meant to address everybody, never, ever. So you start with, if you want, I am in Berlin, you start with Humboldt. So when Humboldt set up his first research university, the Berlin University, now Humboldt University, the only ones who were able to enter the university were white bourgeois men, nobody else. It took a long time until women were allowed to enter the university. It took a long time until non-white Europeans were allowed to enter the university. And this was at the same time when Humboldt was explaining why a humanist way of education is very, very important. I always think that education has to be seen as the real threat for the majority, because that's why also the somehow this strategy to not let everybody have access to education, and we see it very, it was very, very strongly put also in the paper of Zachariah, how difficult it is to put up the claim on, and it is a human right, no, we know that, the right of education. So there must be also an anxiety to let everybody get access to education, which I find very interesting, and we have to address that. But more on top of that, that we have to fight for the right of education for everybody globally, we have to also talk about the quality of education. Who who gets access to which kind of education and how. And I think, Mohammed, you also has shown in your paper that, of course, there is a difference. Who is the student of the education that it's addressed to? So when we see in the welcome classes, we don't have a curriculum. It doesn't seem to be necessary to have a curriculum. And there is still racism in the classroom where you think, like, how can that happen? In 2020 in Germany, what happened to the education of the teacher, which is a very, very important thing. And I think that one of the very important point is here transnational literacy. We have to somehow be able also to somehow formate subjects in schools that have like a kind of an ethical reflex, so that then they really feel and are affected by dehumanization, which are affected immediately by, for example, racism or Islamophobia, and react to that. And there is where the subject come in, and structurally, of course, we have to make sure that in the schools, this is something that is kind of trained, that the minds and also through the mind, also the way the emotions work, that there are subjects that really react to dehumanization and to marginalization, etc. Because what we are now seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic is shocking, but actually, if we are very honest, not surprising. None of us on the panel are really surprised of what is happening, but it is still shocking. So, and we have to come to a point where we are surprised that this is still possible. And for that, I am contrary to Ayhan, still believe in the state. I think that the state has a very ambivalent role. It always had a very ambivalent role, but we can't let go of the state. We have to make the states accountable. We have to make them accountable and to show them that what they're doing is, like Nikita Dhawan always says, a pharmacon. It can be poison, but it can be also turned into medicine. If the state is accountable of everybody living in the inside the borders of the state and also in front of their borders, then that might change also radically a lot of things that we are now seeing and experiencing. After all, it is for me always very interesting to see that when I talk in conferences and it is about refugees, very often people from the global south come to me and say, like, Germany is still a role model. You know, it's still, and I'm living in Germany, I'm like constantly criticizing the state, I'm criticizing the migration politics, but if you see it in a global perspective, there are still some things that here work that in other countries don't, but they have to do their job. And that means, how and Liz put it very nicely, not to abandon the people living at the mercy still of the state. So I think that talking about education, we need a lot of hope in hopeless times. We need to keep up our hope, because the right-wing parties and the right-wing collectives, they are not all part of parties also, they are somehow better able right now to talk we the people, you know, to make we the people somehow sounding something like that talks to them. And because I, in contrast to Ayhan, think that populist strategies come actually from the left. They were just appropriated by the right. And how can we, again, the progressive, the liberals, the leftists, come up with also populist strategies where a majority of people, and this is about hegemony, like Gramsci would say, the majority of the people think that to live a better life, to have a chance to survive this pandemic and to turn around what we are facing now, a climate catastrophe, a financial catastrophe, and so on, we have to become human again. Yeah, that it is part of it is to really enlarge our imagination, to build a bridge, like Liz put it, and maybe to find ways to also counter what we now see in conspiracy narratives, which also comes at no surprise, and they're filled with racism and anti-Semitism, and to find new ways. And I think that should be in the heart of education and politics, of kind of a memory politics. Jacques Derrida once said that deconstruction is not a method, but is after all nothing else than memory politics. We have to see in the heart also of Western theories, of Western ideas of education. We have to find the contradictions. We have to find why marginalization and dehumanization is part of the educational policy for 100 years already, and that is nothing new. And I think, and I'm still an optimist, I'm a very, very pessimist optimist, to put it like that, you know. So like I see what is happening right now. I think it's a really a tragedy what is happening also now in the COVID-19, not because I suffer from lockdown, because being privileged as I am, I'm not really suffering from lockdown. You know, this is like, we have to see that in the global south, the biggest problem will come after the pandemic, because there will be a lot of people who will die of hunger and not because of the virus. Still, hope against hope, and we should maybe try to bring ethics again into our discussion of education and imagination. And that's why I think that it is very important. And you also talked about, I found it very interesting, Zachariah, that the first thing that you mentioned also were art and music. And that you came also and brought into the discussion a very nice quote by Rumi. I think that the aesthetics, literature, and music is also part, or has to be part of our politics again. And we have to also fill the curriculum again with our poets globally, not only the European poets, but globally, with philosophy, with literature, with music, because it will be like the vaccine that we need against dehumanization. Maybe then we are able to build what already Fanon in the 16th asked for, a new humanism. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Maria, for these very analytical and thought-provoking comments. Now we have come to the end of this panel, but Ayhan has a comment to you, Maria. Maybe you can read it in the chat box. He says that he didn't say I didn't say that I trust the states. On the contrary, I said I trust the individuals coming from within migrant origin communities. So that's a clarification.
Exactly, I said that because I trust the state also. I don't trust the individuals only. It won't work. You have to you have to find like ways to work together. That was my point.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you all, Ayhan, Liz, Zachariah, and Mohammed for your presentations, and Maria for your incisive comments. And I would also like to once again thank the organizers, Ellen and Ioana, and as an institution, Istanbul Policy Center, Stiftung Mercator initiative for organizing this conference. So, and thanks to our attendees who have stayed with us until this time of the evening. Okay, well, the conference will continue tomorrow with more panels. Good evening to all of you. Thank you very much.